Morning everybody. Let's now have a look at the important part of this section. Planning a program with repetition and compiling test data. Remember, planning a program is just that. We are trying to solve a problem and we're doing some initial background before we start coding. Now, if this planning of ours is not done properly, we're going to struggle with the program. Maybe not with the coding, but very often with the execution thereof. There might be many logical errors in the program. That's why the planning is so important. Compiling test data is important because I'm going to use this to test if my program works, to test if the actual program that we've coded conforms to all the specifications given. And test data is then crucial because if I don't have good test data, I can't test the program thoroughly. I never know if it's working, yes or not. Okay. For the very first example of test data and planning, I'm going to use the program where we need to calculate and display the sum of all numbers from 1 to 10 on the screen. Now normally when we do the planning, the specific loop statement isn't necessarily very important. Okay, we just want to indicate that we've got a loop. But I'm going to show you how I'll indicate that the for loop and the do while loop then is used. We're going to start with the for loop. I've then opened the planning document for modules. We actually don't have any modules in this part of the code, so I'm just going to delete that. I'm going to specify this is program 47, sum of 1 to 10. And this would be the button, display sum, let's say, event procedure. Okay, we are not going to get any input in this program. If we can have a look at the program again, we simply state that the program must display all numbers from 1 to 10 on the screen using a for loop. So in this specific program, we actually don't have any input. We're going to have some output. We need the sum of all the numbers. Maybe we'll say that would be the description, the sum of 1 to 10. This sum displayed once, we can display this in a label. We can use a list box as well. I think for the purpose of this explanation, we're going to use a list box to display first of all the numbers and then the sum. So I'm going to say that's list box display, that it would be displayed in. And I like to call each number that we're going to display very often count, because this would be my counter variable. Apologies, this would be my counter variable. I'm also going to display this in the list box display. Now the test data for a loop like that, we're going to struggle to fill that in the grid that is given to us currently. So I would like to do the test data a little bit different. Let's just have a look. If my counter goes from 1 to 10, then it means counter initially would be 1, the sum would need to be 1. Then the counter will be increased to 2, and the sum will become 3. If the counter changes to 3, my sum will change to 6. I just quickly filled in all the data for us. So I kept a running total of the sum. We're only going to display the sum right at the end. So I know after the 10 numbers, the sum would be 55. Okay, and this then sufficient for my test data. I'm going to do the following for the button event procedure. So first of all, the name, button display sum, and we're going to say initialize the counter. This time around I will initialize it to 1, so I state there I need to also initialize sum to 0. Over here we can simply just specify that we've got a loop, and we can specify here what the loop would do. Counter will go from 1 to 10. Inside the loop we want to display counter, and then we are going to increment counter, but before we go add 1, increment it, we want to add count to sum. We're going to specify that we've got the end of the loop, and after the end of the loop we're going to display sum to the user. Okay, so something like this. We specify what the initial values would be for my variables. This later on can now be implemented when you code the program as either a for or a do while loop or any of the other loop statements available. Display counter, add count to sum. If I use a for loop, this would be done. If I use a for loop though, this is done automatically in the program. I specify where the end of the loop would be, and I specify that sum would be displayed after the loop. So these are then the steps needed for us for program 47, where we're going to display from 1 to 10 on the screen and also the total. Remember, this planning just tells you what would happen in the program. So if we now go and implement the real program, we can choose to use either a for or a do while loop statement. Let's now have a look at program 48. This program states that we need to get 10 numbers from the user. We need to accumulate the total of all the numbers, and we need to count how many positive and negative numbers were entered. And after all 10 numbers are entered, display the total, the number of positive and the number of negative numbers. So again, this program doesn't have a function or a procedure. This is program 48. I'm just going to say sum of 10 numbers entered by the user. Again, we can have something like button, 10 numbers that we're going to put on the screen every time that we execute some or another event. It would be via a button that is clicked. Okay, if we have a look at the input, the user will enter a number for me. This time around, we're not going to use a text box. We need to use input box to get the number, because all the input that we get in a loop must happen via input box. As explained in the first video, we can't get input in a loop using a text box. We need to use input box for the input. We need to have quite a few things that we can display to the user. So if we can have a look at that, it's the total, the number of positive numbers, and the number of negative numbers. So total, the total of the input numbers, and I'm going to display this in the list box. All my data I'm going to now display using a list box. I need a counter for the positive, so the number of positive numbers. I'll need a counter for the negative values. I'm going to display all of these still in the same list box. I will need to count that I get 10 numbers. So this 1 to 10 that I'm counting, I'm not going to get as input or out, going to display that as output. So this would be another variable. I'm going to count the iterations using that. Let's just go and look at the question again. Code a program to get 10 numbers from the user. I get my 10 numbers. Accumulate the total. I've got a counter. Count how many positive and negative numbers I entered. I've got that. After all 10 numbers are entered, display the total number of positive and number of negative numbers. Okay. I then have all my input needed. I can go have a look at the steps. So I'm going to initialize count to 1. I'm going to count all my numbers from that. I'm going to initialize total to 0. Just write it like that. I'm going to initialize count positive to 0. I need to count how many there are. So they need to. It's real crucial that they start at 0. Count negative must also be initialized to 0. And now I've got my loop and my counter variable will go from 1 to 10. Remember the end of the loop. I'm just going to add mine immediately. Inside the loop, and we indent this a little bit, we need to get a number from the user and we need to save that in the number. We're going to get that from input box. So we're just going to say number is equal to input box. We're going to ask the user enter a number. We don't worry too much about the conversions. And now we need to accumulate the total. So total is equal to total plus number. And now I need to test. So I can say test if the number is positive or negative. And my if statement will look like this. If number is bigger or equal to 0, if you add the then there, it's fine, but not really necessary for our planning. If the number is bigger or equal to 0, we want to increment count positive. Positive. Otherwise, we want to increment count negative. And that would be the end of the if statement. So the loop will get a number, accumulate the total, test if it's negative or positive, either increment this or that. End loop will jump over there. I just need to remember with my counter incrementation. Increment count. Because count must go from 1 to 10. We already specified that it would start at 1. We need the increment as well. After the loop, we're going to specify that we display the total, display count positive, and we're going to display count negative. Can leave this. So we're going to display all those output values. Okay, so what's left would be my test data. Now for this, Excel is just a lot easier. You're very welcome to do this manually on a piece of paper. So I've got a number, I've got a total, I've got a count positive, I've got a count negative, and I've got my count variable. So right at the start, this is initialized to 1, and these things are initialized to 0. Let's just make sure everything is sorted. As soon as my loop starts, the user is going to enter a number for me. So that means total would be the old value plus the new value. This would be count positive, I'm going to add 1, count negative stays as it is, and at the end of the loop, my counter variable will become, well, let's just not include that immediately. So for the second iteration, let's say user enters 22, total gets updated. This is a positive value, so 2, that, and my counter was, let's say, incremented at the end. Let's go and show how the counter is incremented at the end of the loop. Third iteration of the loop. Let's say the user enters 5. Total is updated. This is again a positive value. And the counter is incremented. User enters some value for me. Oops. Just undo. We'll need to enter a negative value just now. Counter is updated. So let's go for minus 55. Counter is updated. This stays at 3. That would be 1. And the counter becomes 6. If I go and enter another positive value, let's say, counter will become 4. Made a mistake over there, hey? Actually, as soon as we get to 88, that counter will be incremented. So that would be 4 and this would be 5. Need to make sure the count negative stays as it is. Counter is incremented. So if we go for another negative value, let's say minus 33, make sure the total is updated. That would means that my positive count stays as it is, negative count is added, counter is updated. Let's go for another negative value. Positive stays as it is, the counter is updated for negative. I've got one more value that we entered. So let's go for 30. I've got one more positive value. Negative stays as it is. Counter is updated, but this is done at the end of the loop. So have a look, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. I need one more iteration of the loop. So let's go for minus 4. That means this stays as it is. 4. And now that my counter value will become more than 10, the loop will stop. Okay, and I then have my totals that would be displayed to the user. So I can copy all of this to my planning document, or simply save it in the same folder under the right name. Let's just go and include this, and we say this is the test data. And we made provision for positive and negative values. So we can say after all input values are entered, the last row data will be displayed. So this would be the 103, the 6, and the 4, because those are the 3 things we are displaying. Program 49 follows sort of the same example as 48. Program 50 is a little bit different. Have a look. We still need to get 5 values, but now we need to make provision for invalid values that the user might give. I want to give you a little bit of help with program 50. I'm not going to complete all the necessary sections, only the things where it's really necessary. So for now, the loop is the most important thing. This time it matters, I can't use a for loop. So in my planning, I'm going to show that I've got a do while loop. That's going to continue while the counter is less or equal to 5. We can now maybe also go and include the initialize count to 0. I'm not including everything, but initialize count to 0. I've got a loop, but this time I must use a do loop because sometimes when the user made an error, I don't want to continue with the data. So I can't use a for loop. Um, I'm going to input the distance, and now I'm going to test if the distance is valid. So if the distance is bigger than 0. If it is, I'm going to increment the counter and add up all my totals, do what I need to. If it's not, I simply display an error message, and that's the end of the loop. The rest of the statements you need to go and have a look at. Add. I want to show you this part here. We might get 6 input values. One is negative. I can't use a for loop. I need to use a do while loop. Do while loops are used in these circumstances where I don't know, here we go, exactly how many input values because the user might give me 1, 0, or many incorrect input values. Program 51, it's got a nested if statement here. And program 52, again, we need to make provision for invalid grades. Okay, so test data, extremely important for these programs. Have fun doing that. Thank you.